In a land forged by blood and fear, the line between survival and savagery was as thin as a whisper on the wind. The year is 1878 in the heart of the Arizona Territory, a place where the United States cavalry swore to tame the land, and the Apache swore to die free upon it. This isn't a story of cowboys and simple gunfights. It's the chronicle of an impossible choice made by a lone settler's daughter, Adrian Finch. When she found a wounded warrior, the most hated and feared enemy of her people, bleeding out in a dry creek bed, she could have left him for the vultures. Instead, she chose a secret that would cost her everything, and a love that would ignite the entire frontier. The Arizona sun was a merciless god. It bleached the very color from the sky, baked the earth into a cracked mosaic of ochre and rust, and shimmered over the distant mesas like a fever dream. For Adrian Finch, the sun was just another fixture in a life of harsh constants. At 19, her hands were already calloused from hauling water-mending fences and working a stubborn patch of earth that gave up its corn and beans with resentful reluctance. Her world was the small, defensible homestead built by her father, Thomas Finch. It was a lonely outpost of 2 solid log buildings and a corral clinging to the edge of Whisper Creek, which was at this time of year little more than a memory of water haunted by sun-bleached stones. Thomas was a hard man, his spirit as weathered as his face, his words as sparse as the rainfall. He'd brought them out here after Adrian's mother succumbed to consumption, back in Missouri, chasing a dream of independence that felt more like a sentence of isolation with each passing year. Fear was the air they breathed. It wasn't the abstract fear of the dark or the unknown. It was a specific, ever-present dread that had a name, Apache. To the settlers and the soldiers garrisoned at Fort Grant, 30 miles east, the Apache were phantoms, spoken of in hushed, terrified tones. They were the Chiricahua, the wild ones, masters of the landscape, who fought a desperate, brutal war against the encroaching tide of white settlement. Every strangely broken twig, every distant dust devil, every coyote's howl at dusk could be a sign. The soldiers were a different kind of fear. They were supposed to be protectors, but they rode with an arrogance that curdled into cruelty. They saw the settlers as bait, and the Apache as vermin, and their brand of justice was swift and often indiscriminate. Their patrols, led by men like Sergeant Frank McCall, were a common sight. McCall was a man carved from gristle and prejudice, with a sneer permanently etched beneath his thick mustache. He often stopped at the Finch homestead for water, his eyes lingering on Adrian in a way that made her skin crawl as if he were assessing livestock. "Just keep your head down and your rifle clean, girl," Thomas would grumble after they'd left. "We ain't part of their war. We're just trying to live on the land." But the land itself had other plans. It happened on a Tuesday in late August, when the heat was at its most oppressive. Thomas had taken their wagon to the small, dusty settlement of Pinnell Creek for supplies, a 2-day journey. Adrian was alone, a fact that always set a quiet hum of anxiety beneath her chores. She was mending a leather strap for the water pump when she heard it a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the scuttling of a lizard or the flap of a hawk's wings. It was a low-grown, half-human, half-animal, carried on the hot breeze from the direction of the dry creek bed. Her first instinct was a spike of pure terror. Apache. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and her hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered on her father's gun belt, which she wore whenever he was away. She crept to the edge of the small bluff overlooking the creek, her movements slow, deliberate. Down below, half hidden by a cluster of mesquite and palo verde, was a man. He was Apache, there was no mistaking it. His long black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, a simple leather band tied around his forehead. He wore only a breechcloth and worn moccasins. He was on his hands and knees, trying to drag himself forward, leaving a slick, dark trail in the pale sand. His back was a canvas of raw, torn flesh, a grotesque wound that looked like he'd been flayed by shrapnel, and a darker, deeper stain was spreading across his side, a gunshot. He collapsed face down in the dust. He was dying. Adrian's mind screamed at her. "Run, get the rifle, lock the door. He's the enemy. He would kill you without a second thought. His people burned the Miller homestead last spring, left nothing but ash and bodies." She watched him, her knuckles white on the grip of the pistol. He wasn't moving. The vultures were already beginning to circle high above, patient black specks against the searing blue. She saw the tremor that racked his body, a final, desperate shudder of life. And in that moment, he was no longer a phantom, no longer the faceless monster from the soldiers' stories. He was just a man bleeding his life into the unforgiving earth, the same earth she struggled with every single day. A verse her mother used to read from a tattered Bible echoed in her mind, something about a stranger, about kindness. It felt like a voice from another world, a world of softness and mercy that had no place here. "Fool," she whispered to herself, the word swallowed by the wind. But her feet were already moving. She slid down the loose scree of the embankment the colt held out in front of her heart a frantic drum. He didn't stir as she approached. His breathing was a shallow, ragged rasp. His skin was fever-hot to the touch. The bullet wound in his side was deep, and the gash on his back was already beginning to fester under the relentless sun. He would be dead in an hour. Looking back at her silent, empty cabin, then down at the dying man, Adrian made the choice that would unravel her world. She holstered the pistol. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her hands under his arms. He was lean but dense with muscle, a dead weight. With a strength born of desperation and a lifetime of labor, she began to drag him out of the creek bed and toward the one place he would never be found, the small, dark root cellar beneath her cabin floor. The root cellar was Adrian's sanctuary of secrets. It smelled of damp earth potatoes and smoked bacon. A single beam of dusty light filtered through a crack in the floorboards above. Here in the cool darkness, the Apache warrior lay on a bed of old grain sacks, drifting in and out of a fevered consciousness. Her first task was the bullet. Her father had taught her the grim necessities of frontier medicine. She had a bottle of whiskey, a sharp skinning knife, and a healthy dose of terror. As she cleaned the wound with a rag soaked in precious water, the man's eyes flickered open. They were the color of dark, wet obsidian, and for a moment they were clear-focused and filled with a cold, hard fire. He saw the knife in her hand, and his body tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "I'm—" Helping Adrian stammered the words, feeling foreign and foolish. "The bullet. It has to come out." He didn't understand her words, but he seemed to understand the intent. Or perhaps he was simply too weak to fight. His eyes held hers for a long moment, a silent, primal negotiation. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he gave a slight nod. He closed his eyes and braced himself. The next 10 minutes were a blur of gritted teeth and stifled cries, mostly her own. The warrior remained unnervingly silent as she probed for the lead slug, his body rigid, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles bulge. When the slug finally scraped against her knife, she worked it free and dropped it with a clatter into a tin bowl. He didn't pass out. He simply lay there breathing in harsh, controlled gasps. She poured raw whiskey over the wound. This time, he couldn't suppress a sharp hiss of breath through his teeth, his body arching in agony. Then he went limp, finally surrendering to the encroaching darkness. For 3 days, this became her life. By day, she performed her chores with a frantic, watchful energy, her ears straining for the sound of horses. Every shadow seemed to hold the figure of Sergeant McCall. Every gust of wind sounded like a shouted command. At night, she would slip down into the cellar with a lantern, changing his bandages, strips torn from her own petticoats, and forcing sips of broth between his cracked lips. His fever raged. He spoke in a language that was all harsh consonants and soft vowels, a torrent of words she couldn't understand. In his delirium, he would sometimes lash out his hands, surprisingly strong, and she would have to pin his arms until the fit passed. During these moments, she saw the raw power in him, the coiled violence that the soldiers spoke of, and fear would chill her to the bone. But there were other moments, too. Moments of quiet lucidity, when his fever would break. He would simply watch her, his obsidian eyes tracking her every move. There was no gratitude in his gaze, not at first. There was suspicion, confusion, and a warrior's pride, deeply wounded. They began to communicate in a language of gestures. He would point to the water bucket. She would point to the bandages and make a motion of rapping. She learned his name was not a name, but a sound, a feeling. When she tried to ask, he touched his chest and said a word that sounded like Kyle. It meant something akin to one who moves like the wind. She told him hers, Adrian, and he repeated it softly, the syllables clumsy but recognizable on his tongue. The real connection came on the fourth night. His fever had finally broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. Adrian brought him a bowl of thin corn stew. He ate slowly, methodically. When he was done, he looked at the empty bowl, then at her. He reached out his fingers, tracing the frayed edge of one of the petticoat bandages on his side. He then looked at her hands, red and chapped from lye soap and hard work. His gaze was intense, analytical. He said something quiet, a question. She shook her head, not understanding. He then gestured to himself, then made a sweeping motion toward the distant mountains, the Chiricahua stronghold. He tapped his chest. Then he pointed at her and made a gesture of a roof with his hands, indicating her home. He looked back and forth between the two, his brow furrowed. He was asking the most fundamental question of all, why help your enemy? Adrian had no answer she could give him in words. She thought of the soldier's smug cruelty, of her father's grim resignation, of the lonely, brutal existence she led. She thought of the vultures circling in the sky. She met his gaze and simply shrugged a small, helpless gesture. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Not understanding, perhaps, but acknowledgement. A fragile bridge had been built in the silent earthen dark. The next day, Sergeant McCall and his patrol returned. Adrian was outside shaking out a rug when she heard the familiar jingle of harnesses. Her blood ran cold. She forced a neutral expression onto her face as the 4 soldiers rode up their horses, kicking up plumes of yellow dust. "Miss Finch," McCall said, his voice a lazy drawl. "He didn't dismount. Still holding down the fort for your pa. He'll be back tomorrow, Sergeant." Good. His eyes scanned the homestead, lingering on the cellar door, a heavy wooden flap set flat against the ground near the cabin's foundation. "We're tracking a stray. One of Goyathle's boys. Got separated from his war party near the San Pedro. Left a blood trail a blind man could follow. It led this way." Adrian's heart felt like it had stopped. She could feel Kyle's presence beneath her feet, a living, breathing secret. "Haven't seen anyone," she said, her voice miraculously steady. "Just lizards and dust." McCall's eyes narrowed. He was a predator, sensing a hidden fear. "You sure about that aiding one of them? Well, that's the same as being one of them in the eyes of the army." Same punishment, too. He let the threat hang in the air. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. We'll just take a look around. Corporal Hayes, check the barn. Johnson, the corral. McCall swung himself down from his horse, his boots thudding onto the hard-packed earth. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the cabin, his gaze fixed on the cellar door. Cozy little place. Must get mighty hot, though. Good place to keep things cool, I'd wager. Under the ground. Each step he took was a hammer blow to Adrian's chest. This was it. It was over. She imagined the cellar being thrown open, the flash of sunlight, the explosion of violence. She braced herself for the gunshot. Sergeant McCall stopped directly in front of the cellar door. He nudged it with the toe of his dusty boot. The wood groaned softly. Adrian held her breath, her hand hovering near the pistol she wasn't wearing. Her mind raced a frantic prayer running through it. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Down below, in the near-total darkness, Cale was awake. He had heard the horses, the voices. He lay perfectly still on the grain sacks, his hand gripping the handle of the skinning knife Adrian had left behind. He could smell the soldier above him, a scent of stale sweat tobacco and white man's arrogance. If the door opened, he would not die cowering. He would take at least one of them with him into the darkness. "What's in there, Miss Finch?" McCall asked, his voice deceptively casual. He wasn't looking at her, but at the door as if he could see right through it. "Roots," Adrian said, her voice tight. "Potatoes, preserves. Things for the winter." "Mind if I take a look? This heat gives a man a powerful thirst. Maybe you got some cider pressed down there?" He reached down and gripped the thick iron ring used to lift the door. Time seemed to slow. The buzzing of flies sounded like a roar. Adrian saw it all play out in a flash. McCall would open the door. Kyle would leap up with the knife. There would be a gunshot, and her life, along with his, would end right here in the blood-soaked dust. "No!" The word escaped her lips, sharper than she intended. McCall froze his hand on the ring. He straightened up slowly and turned to face her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He had her. The fear in her voice was a confession. "No," he repeated softly. "A polite young lady like you refusing a thirsty soldier a little hospitality. Now I'm downright curious." He was toying with her. He knew something was wrong. Just as he bent down again, a shout came from the direction of the creek bed. "Sarge over here." It was Corporal Hayes. McCall shot Adrian a look that promised this wasn't over and strode toward the creek. Adrian followed her legs, feeling like lead. Hayes was pointing at the ground, at the spot where she had first found Cale. "Blood trail just like you said," Hayes announced, puffing out his chest. "And look." He pointed further down the creek. There were tracks, not Cale's, but the tracks of a shod horse heading south, away from the homestead. Looks like his friends must have doubled back, picked him up. He's long gone. McCall studied the tracks, kicking at the dirt. His face was a mask of frustration. He had been so close to something. He could feel it. He looked back at Adrian, his eyes filled with suspicion, but he had no proof. The evidence pointed away from her home, not toward it. "Mount up!" he snarled at his men. He turned to Adrian, his voice a low threat. "You're a lucky woman today, Miss Finch, but this ain't over. We find that stray, and we'll be asking him who patched him up. Apache have long memories. So do I." She watched them ride away, a cloud of dust in their wake, and only then did the strength go out of her legs. She stumbled back to the cabin and collapsed against the door, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had stared into the abyss, and for a reason she couldn't explain, it had blinked. Later, when she was sure they were gone, she went down into the cellar. Kyle was sitting up, the knife still in his hand. The sliver of light from above caught the intensity in his eyes. He had heard everything. He knew how close it had been. That night, the silence between them was different. It was no longer just the absence of a shared language, it was a shared experience. He watched her as she redressed the wound on his side. It was beginning to heal cleanly. His fingers brushed against hers as she worked, and this time she didn't pull away. The touch was not threatening, nor was it tender. It was a simple acknowledgement, a recognition. He knew he couldn't stay. His presence put her in mortal danger. 2 nights later, under the sliver of a new moon, he was ready. His strength had returned, his movements once again fluid and sure. He stood by the cabin door, a ghost in the moonlight. He was dressed in a pair of her father's old trousers and a shirt which looked strange on his warrior's frame. Adrian had packed him a small sack with dried meat, a full canteen of water, and the skinning knife. He turned to her. There were no words for what needed to be said. He reached out, and for the first time his touch was gentle. He took a small piece of turquoise tied to a leather thong from around his own neck and pressed it into her hand. It was smooth and cool against her skin. A payment, a promise she didn't know. Kyle! She whispered the name, feeling sacred on her tongue. He met her eyes, and in their dark depths she saw a fire that was no longer cold. He said her name, Adrian. The sound, a soft echo in the vast, silent night. Then he gave a single sharp nod, turned and melted into the darkness, moving north toward the Dragoon Mountains. He was gone, as if he had never been. 2 days later, Thomas Finch returned. He found his daughter quieter, her eyes holding a new somber depth. He noticed the missing petticoats, the slightly depleted stock of whiskey and dried meat, but he said nothing. To ask questions on the frontier was to invite trouble you didn't want. But trouble had a way of finding you anyway. A month later, a drifter passing through Pinnell Creek, a man named Silas Croft, was captured by an Apache raiding party. He was held for 2 days, and then inexplicably released, left to wander back to the settlement. When the cavalry debriefed him, he told a strange story. He said the Apache who let him go had asked him a question. He wanted to know about the white woman at Whisper Creek. The drifter, eager to save his own skin, told them everything he knew about the Finch homestead and the solitary daughter. The information made its way to Sergeant McCall. For him, it was the final piece of the puzzle. The blood trail, the daughter's fear, the mysterious horse tracks leading away from the property, it all clicked into place. He didn't have proof, but he had certainty. And for a man like McCall, certainty was more than enough. He went to his commanding officer at Fort Grant, Captain Sterling, a man who believed order in the territory could only be achieved through absolute, unyielding pressure. The story of the settler's daughter who harbored an Apache warrior was not just a crime, it was an act of sedition. It was a crack in the wall of fear and hatred they had so carefully constructed. And it had to be sealed. The arrival of the soldiers was different this time. It wasn't a patrol of 4 weary men, but a column of 12 riding with purpose. At their head was Captain Harrison Sterling, a man whose clean-shaven face and perfectly pressed uniform seemed an affront to the gritty landscape. Beside him, with a look of smug vindication, rode Sergeant McCall. They found Adrian and Thomas working near the corral. Thomas, seeing the number of soldiers, immediately reached for the rifle propped against the fence. "That's far enough, Finch," Captain Sterling called out, his voice crisp and authoritative. His men fanned out, creating a semicircle, their carbines held at the ready. It was an occupation, not a visit. "This is my land, Captain," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. "State your business." "My business," Sterling said, dismounting with practiced ease, "is treason. Sergeant McCall has brought me a very disturbing report concerning your daughter." Adrian felt a cold dread wash over her. She saw the triumphant look in McCall's eyes, and knew. Sterling laid out the story, as if he were reading from a charge sheet, the blood trail her defiance, and now the testimony from the released captive. It was a story woven from suspicion and circumstantial evidence, but he presented it as undeniable fact. She harbored a Chiricahua hostile. Sterling concluded, his cold blue eyes locking onto Adrian. She gave aid and comfort to the enemy. In a time of war, that is an act for which people are hanged. Thomas Finch went pale. "That's a lie," he spat. "My daughter is a God-fearing woman. She knows what those savages are." "Is it a lie, Miss Finch?" Sterling asked, his voice silky smooth. Adrian looked at her father's terrified, angry face. She looked at McCall's sneer. She could deny it. She could lie and scream and cry, and maybe they would leave the seed of doubt planted. But as she stood there with the weight of 12 rifles aimed in her direction, something inside her hardened. She thought of Cale, of the quiet dignity in his eyes, of the moment he had nodded his assent as she held the knife. She had made her choice in that cellar, and she would not dishonor it with a coward's lie. "No!" she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence. "It is not a lie." The admission struck her father like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. "Adrian." "No." Captain Sterling smiled, a thin, chilling expression. "I admire your honesty, if not your judgment. It saves us a great deal of time. He wasn't going to hang her. A hanging would create a martyr and stir up trouble with the other settlers. He had a more insidious punishment in mind. You are hereby declared an Indian sympathizer. This homestead is placed under military quarantine. No one is to enter or leave without army permission. Your supplies will be cut off. You will receive no aid, no protection." He turned to his men. "Sergeant, search the premises. Confiscate all firearms, save for 1 pistol and 6 rounds. If they are attacked, it seems only fair they face the same odds as their friends." McCall and his men ransacked the homestead with relish. They tore through the cabin, overturning furniture, dumping flour onto the floor. They took Thomas's prized Winchester rifle, his shotgun, and all their ammunition. They left them with only the old Colt Peacemaker. As they mounted to leave, Sterling delivered his final blow. "Let this be a lesson, Miss Finch. There are 2 sides in this war. You chose the wrong one. Now you will live with the consequences. Let's see how long your compassion lasts when you're starving." The quarantine was a slow, creeping death sentence. Word spread like wildfire through the sparse settler community. The Finches were pariahs. The weekly circuit rider, a preacher named Reverend Miller, galloped past their turnoff without a glance. When Thomas rode toward Pinnell Creek in a desperate attempt to trade for flour, he was met by a group of armed men at the edge of town and told to turn back. He was the father of a traitor. His presence wasn't welcome. Their world shrank to the confines of their sun-baked plot of land. The loneliness Adrian had always known deepened into a profound, suffocating isolation. Worse than the hunger and the fear was the silence from her father. He worked from sunup to sundown, a grim automaton-like figure. He wouldn't look at her, wouldn't speak to her, except for the barest of necessities. His daughter, the only family he had left, had betrayed not only her people, but his trust. The chasm that opened between them was as wide and barren as the desert itself. One evening, as they sat in silence, eating a meager meal of boiled corn, Thomas finally spoke. His voice was raw with pain. "I don't understand, Abby," he rasped, staring at his hands. "After what they did to the Millers, to so many. Why would you help one of them?" Adrian looked out the window at the darkening landscape. How could she explain it? How could she describe the feeling of seeing a man, not a monster, dying in the dust? He was just a person, Pa. He was hurt. Leaving him felt like a sin. A sin, Thomas scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. The sin was bringing his war to our doorstep. We were neutral. We were surviving. You've destroyed that. You've condemned us both. The weight of his words was heavier than any soldier's threat. She had not only endangered them, she had shattered her father's world. The guilt was a physical thing, a constant ache in her chest. Their isolation made them vulnerable. A week later, Samuel Reed, a neighboring rancher, whose land bordered theirs to the south, rode over. Reed was a widower in his 40s, a man with a reputation for sharp dealing and a possessive nature. He had made clumsy advances toward Adrian in the past, all of which she had rebuffed. He found her by the well. "Heard you're in a spot of trouble, Adrian," he said, his eyes roaming over her with a newfound confidence. "We're fine, Mr. Reed," she said coldly. "No, you ain't," he said, swinging down from his horse. "You're alone, unprotected. A woman like you, a tainted woman now, needs a man to look after her. Your pa is a broken old man. He can't keep you safe." He took a step closer. "Marry me. I'll speak to Captain Sterling. My word carries weight. I'll tell him you've learned your lesson, that you're under my control now. He'll lift the quarantine. I can save you, Adrian." The offer was grotesque. It wasn't a proposal. It was a predator circling. He saw her not as a wife, but as a disgraced property to be claimed. "I would rather starve," she said, her voice trembling with rage. Reed's face darkened. "Pride is a luxury you can't afford. You'll change your mind when the Apaches come back for a real visit. And when they do, don't expect me or anyone else to lift a finger." He rode off, leaving her with another layer of fear. The world was closing in, and every face, white or native, seemed to hold a threat. Her act of mercy had left her utterly terrifyingly alone. All she had left was a faded memory of a warrior's dark eyes and a smooth piece of turquoise she kept hidden in her pocket, a talisman against despair. The seasons turned with a grinding indifference. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek bed, a brief, brilliant yellow, before winter brought a thin, biting wind that whistled through the chinks in the cabin walls. For the finches, it was a season of gnawing hunger and cold silence. Their stores dwindled. They were reduced to eating squirrels and rabbits. Adrian managed to trap a meager bounty. Thomas grew gaunt, his silence deepening into a hollow-eyed despair. The quarantine held fast. Meanwhile, whispers began to trickle through the territory, carried by the few prospectors and drifters who dared to traverse the land. They were stories of a new kind of Apache leader. Not a wild-eyed butcher like the ones in the settlers' nightmares, but a ghost, a strategist. They called him Twaesh Ka, the serpent arrow. This chief, the stories said, didn't lead chaotic raids on isolated homesteads. He fought the soldiers. He led daring, precise strikes against cavalry patrols and supply wagons. He knew their tactics, anticipated their movements. He would materialize from the canyon strike with lethal efficiency and vanish back into the rocks, leaving the soldiers bewildered and blooded. He moved with a speed and cunning that seemed supernatural. He was uniting the scattered Chiricahua bands, forging them into a weapon unlike anything Captain Sterling had ever faced. At Fort Grant, frustration festered. Captain Sterling, a man accustomed to predictable enemies and orderly campaigns, was being outmaneuvered at every turn. He doubled the patrols. He offered bounties for any Apache scalp, a move that only intensified the cycle of violence. Sergeant McCall led these patrols with a particular savagery, his hatred for the Apache now mingled with a personal fury against the phantom leader who was making a fool of the U.S. Army. Adrian heard these stories in fragments when military supply wagons occasionally rumbled past on the main trail a mile from their homestead. The drivers, under strict orders not to interact with her, would sometimes shout news to each other that the wind carried to her ears. Serpent Arrow hit a patrol near Cook's Canyon, wiped 'em out, not a man left, took a whole wagon train of repeating rifles. With each story, a strange, terrifying hope grew in her heart. She didn't know why, but she felt a connection to this unseen warrior. She would stand on the bluff overlooking the creek, the turquoise stone clutched in her hand, and stare at the distant hazy peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. She imagined him there, a shadow moving among the rocks, and wondered if he ever thought of the woman who had pulled him from the dust. The pressure from Captain Sterling's failing campaign fell heavily on the territory. Convinced that the settlers were secretly aiding the Apaches, he tightened his grip. His patrols became more aggressive, demanding food and fodder from homesteads, their questioning bordering on interrogation. The settlers, caught between the cunning of the Serpent Arrow and the brutality of the cavalry, began to live in a state of constant simmering fear. One bitter afternoon in February, Sergeant McCall and his patrol made an unexpected stop at the Finch homestead. It was the first time they had set foot on the property since the day they confiscated the guns. They looked exhausted, their faces grimed with trail dust and frustration. "Captain's orders," McCall grunted, not even looking at Adrian, as his men filled their canteens from her well without asking. "We're commandeering a portion of your remaining livestock, a quarter of your corn." "We have nothing to spare," Thomas said, stepping forward, a spark of his old fire in his eyes. "We're barely surviving as it is thanks to you." McCall turned on him, his frustration boiling over into rage. "You want to know who to thank?" he snarled, getting right in Thomas's face. "Thank your traitor daughter, and thank her friend the Serpent Arrow. Every soldier he kills, every wagon he burns, the price gets higher for everyone. This is his fault. And it's her fault." He jabbed a finger toward Adrian, who stood frozen by the cabin door. "You helped him, didn't you, that day? That was him, the one we're hunting. You saved the devil himself, and now he's unleashed hell on all of us." Adrian stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. Kyle. The name echoed in her soul. It had to be him. The cunning, the silence, the way he moved like a ghost. It was the man she had known in the darkness of her cellar. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Her small act of mercy had not just saved a man. It had unleashed a war chief. She was responsible for the soldiers' deaths, for the escalating violence, for the terror gripping the territory. The thought was staggering. McCall saw the look of horrified recognition on her face. "Yeah," he said with a cruel laugh. "You see it now, don't you? Every widow back at the fort has you to thank. I hope you're proud." They took 2 of their last 3 chickens and half a sack of precious corn. As they rode away, Adrian sank to the ground, the weight of her actions crushing her. Her father simply stared after the soldiers, his face ashen. He finally understood. The man his daughter had saved was now the scourge of the territory. They were not just outcasts. They were the parents of a monster. That night, a blizzard swept down from the mountains, a rare and violent storm that blanketed the desert in a thick layer of white. Huddled by their small fire, listening to the wind howl like a banshee, Adrian felt the last vestiges of hope die. Cale was alive, but he was a force of destruction. He was a world away fighting a war she had inadvertently fueled. He would never think of her again. She was alone, trapped in a frozen, silent world, waiting for starvation or the violence of one side or the other to finally claim them. She clutched the turquoise stone, but for the first time, It felt cold and lifeless in her hand. Spring arrived not as a gentle promise, but as a brutal thaw that turned the landscape into a sea of mud. The war had reached a fever pitch. The Serpent Arrow Kyle had grown bolder. His forces, once small, disparate bands, now moved as a unified army. They struck the stagecoach lines, disrupted the telegraph wires, and effectively cut off Fort Grant from the rest of the territory. Captain Sterling was a man besieged, his authority crumbling with every new report of a failed patrol. For Adrian and Thomas, life had become a grim routine of survival. They spoke little, the chasm between them filled with unspoken accusations and shared despair. The land around their homestead felt like the edge of the world, a forgotten place where nothing good would ever happen again. The day it changed began like any other. The sun was hot, the sky a vast, empty blue. Adrian was weeding the small garden patch when she felt it, a low rhythmic vibration in the soles of her worn boots. It was a sound, before it was a sound, a tremor in the earth. She straightened up her eyes, scanning the horizon. Thomas felt it too. He came out of the barn, his face etched with a familiar fear. "What is it?" Then they saw it. On the northern ridge where the land rose to meet the foothills of the mountains, a line of figures appeared. Then another and another. They were horsemen, dozens of them. Then 100. Then more. They were not soldiers. They wore no uniforms. They moved with a fluid grace, their lean bodies and flowing hair stark against the skyline. It was an Apache army. Adrian's heart seized in her chest. This was it. The final reckoning. This was the terror she had been warned about her entire life. Samuel Reed's threat echoed in her ears. When they come, don't expect anyone to lift a finger. "Inside!" Thomas croaked, his voice cracking. "Get the gun, Adrian." They scrambled into the cabin, barring the heavy wooden door. Thomas grabbed the Colt Peacemaker, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it. Through a crack in the shutters they watched as the army descended from the ridge. They moved not with the wild, whooping chaos of the stories, but with a terrifying, silent discipline. They fanned out surrounding the small homestead, a tide of warriors that seemed to flow over the land. Adrian could see their faces now. They were painted for war, their expressions grim and unreadable. They carried rifles, new, repeating rifles the kind Kyle had captured, and bows, their quivers full of arrows. There were hundreds of them, more than she could count, a force large enough to wipe out Fort Grant itself. Yet they didn't attack. They simply stopped, forming a wide, silent circle around the cabin, their horses stamping impatiently in the dust. The silence was more terrifying than any war cry. Then from the center of the line, one rider moved forward. He rode a powerful black stallion, and he moved with an unmistakable air of command. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, showing the faint, silvery tracings of old scars. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair. He carried no rifle, only a long, slender lance. He stopped 50 yards from the cabin, his gaze fixed on the closed door. Adrian's breath caught in her throat. The sunlight glinted off the turquoise amulet hanging around his neck, an amulet identical to the one in her pocket. It was Kyle. She let out a small, involuntary gasp. Thomas looked from the warrior outside to his daughter's face, and in her wide, shocked eyes, he saw the whole, impossible story. "It's him," she whispered. Outside, Kyle raised his lance and struck its butt against the hard-packed earth. Thump, 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 3 times. It was a signal, a demand. The army of ghosts waited silent and patient for an answer. From the east, another cloud of dust was rising, a smaller one but moving fast. A cavalry patrol drawn by the incredible sight of an Apache army in the open. Adrian could just make out the blue of their uniforms. At their head, she recognized the figures of Captain Sterling and Sergeant McCall. The patrol reined in sharply about 200 yards away, their horses skittish, their faces a mixture of disbelief and stark terror. They were perhaps 20 men facing an army of over 200. They were flies caught in a spider's web. Captain Sterling shouted something, but his words were lost in the wind. His men raised their carbines, but it was a futile gesture, an act of defiance against a tidal wave. Kyle ignored them completely. His attention remained locked on the cabin. He struck the ground again with his lance. Thump! What does he want? Thomas breathed his knuckles white around the pistol. Adrian didn't know. Was this vengeance? Had he come to burn the homestead that had once been his prison? Was he here to thank her, or to silence her, the last witness to his moment of weakness? She looked at her father's terrified face, at the useless pistol in his hand. She looked out at the silent army, an unstoppable force of nature. And she looked at Kyle, waiting. The fear that had lived in her for a year was suddenly replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. Her story had begun with him, and it would end with him. Taking a deep breath, she unbarred the door and stepped out into the blinding sunlight, alone and unarmed to face the serpent arrow. The moment Adrian stepped outside, a low murmur rippled through the ranks of the Apache warriors. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, hard and curious, fixed upon her. The soldiers watched, stunned into inaction, their rifles half raised. The world seemed to hold its breath. Adrian squinted against the sun, her simple cotton dress fluttering in the breeze. She walked forward slowly, her feet unsteady on the familiar ground that now felt alien like the surface of the moon. She stopped 20 feet from Kyle and his formidable black stallion. He looked down at her, his face impassive, carved from stone. He was no longer the wounded, vulnerable man from her cellar. This was a war chief, a leader of men, his power as palpable as the heat radiating from the earth. But when his eyes met hers, she saw a flicker of the man she had known, the intensity, the intelligence, the silent fire. From the cavalry line, Captain Sterling found his voice. "Finch, get back in the house." "That's an order." Kyle didn't even glance in his direction. He slid from his horse with a liquid grace. He was taller than she remembered. He walked toward her, closing the distance until they stood only an arm's length apart. The scent of sage leather and the wild, open spaces clung to him. He spoke not to her, but to the assembled warriors, his voice clear and strong, resonating with authority. He spoke in the Chiricahua tongue, a language of power and history. Adrian didn't understand the words, but she understood their effect. The warriors watched their expressions, shifting from suspicion to a kind of grudging awe. He then turned his gaze fully upon her. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled something out. It was a necklace not of turquoise, but of intricately carved wooden beads and the polished hollow bones of a small bird. It was a thing of delicate, savage beauty. He spoke again, his voice softer now for her alone. He used the few English words he knew, pieced together with gestures. "You gave life," he said, touching his chest where her bandages had been. "Now, I give honor." Before she could process his words, he turned and strode toward the cavalry line. His warriors tensed their hands, going to their weapons, but he raised a hand, a clear signal for them to stand down. He walked with a fearless, deliberate pace, stopping before Captain Sterling's horse. Sergeant McCall spurred his horse forward, his face purple with rage. "You murdering bastard! You're surrounded!" Kyle looked up at him, and his gaze was so cold, so filled with lethal promise, that McCall physically recoiled, his hand faltering on his pistol. Kyle's focus shifted to Captain Sterling. "You hunt me." Kyle said, his English slow but clear. "You hunt her." He gestured back toward Adrian. "She is not yours to hunt. She is mine." Sterling was speechless, his military mind unable to compute this situation. He was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and utterly outclassed. There will be no more war today. Kyle declared, his voice rising for all to hear, his warriors, the soldiers, and the woman standing by the cabin. Today there is a debt. A debt is paid. He walked back to Adrian, his every step a display of absolute control over the scene. Her father Thomas had emerged from the cabin and stood on the porch, the forgotten pistol dangling from his hand, his face a canvas of utter bewilderment. Kyle stood before Adrian once more. He held up the necklace. "In my world," he said, returning to his careful English, "a woman who saves a warrior's life claims a part of his spirit. His honor is tied to hers." He then did the unthinkable. He dropped to one knee. In the dust of her homestead, before his army, before the United States cavalry, who had hunted him, before her stunned father, the most feared man in the territory, knelt before the outcast settler's daughter. "You are my honor, Adrian Finch," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "Be my wife." The proposal was so audacious, so impossible, it defied reality. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration, a political statement made at the heart of a war zone. It was a bridge being built, or a fuse being lit. Adrian looked at the kneeling warrior, at his army of ghosts, at the impotent soldiers, at her broken father. Her life as a settler's daughter was over. It had ended the moment she dragged a bleeding man into her cellar. She had been living in the ruins ever since. Kyle was not offering her a return to a life she had lost. He was offering her a new one, a terrifying and uncertain future, but a future nonetheless, a future with honor. She thought of the loneliness, the fear, the cold judgment of her own people, and she looked into the eyes of the man who had returned for her, who had brought an army not to destroy but to claim. Slowly she nodded. "Yes." Kyle rose. He gently placed the bone and bead necklace around her neck. He then took her hand. He turned to face the entire world, the warriors, the soldiers, and raised their joined hands into the air. A great ululating cry went up from the Apache warriors. It was not a war cry, but a sound of acclamation, of victory, of a legend being born. Captain Sterling watched, his face pale, his authority shattered. He could not open fire without triggering a massacre from which none of his men would survive. He had been defeated not by force of arms, but by a gesture so bold it had rewritten the rules of the war. Kyle led Adrian to his black stallion. With effortless strength, he lifted her and set her in front of him on the horse's back. He looked once at Thomas Finch, a look of silent mutual understanding passing between the old settler and the young chief. Then, without a backward glance at the soldiers, he turned his horse and began to ride back toward the mountains. His army of ghosts fell into formation, around them a silent, formidable escort. Adrian Finch, the settler's daughter, the outcast, the Indian sympathizer, rode away from the ruins of her old life and into the heart of the Apache stronghold, the wife of the Serpent Arrow, leaving her world and the United States Army in stunned, powerless silence. And so the story of Adrian and Kyle became a whisper on the wind, a legend told around settler campfires and in Apache wiki-ups for generations. They were more than just a man and a woman from two warring worlds. They were a symbol of courage in a land that demanded it, and of a love that defied every boundary of hatred and fear. Theirs was not an easy life. They lived on a knife's edge between two cultures trusted fully by neither, yet their unbreakable bond forged a brief, legendary peace in the valleys of the Dragoon Mountains. They rewrote the rules of their world not with bullets or blades, but with an act of mercy in a dusty cellar and a defiant union under the unforgiving Arizona sun. If their story of courage moved you, if you believe that even in the harshest of times, humanity can find a way, then help us keep these legends alive. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you join a community dedicated to uncovering the incredible untold stories from the dusty pages of history. Thank you for listening.